Welcome to Everyday Torah. We are going into a part 2 series on Pauline authorship for the book of Hebrews. This is Gary. If you've been watching the podcast at all, he needs no introduction. Hey, welcome, Gary, again. I looked over your notes, and I must say, I'm excited about this one. Look, I'm excited about all of them, right? Yeah. But I'm excited about this one because a lot of times when I'm reviewing notes or the material we're going to go over, I'm like, okay, I've read that and I've kind of dealt with some of these things. Some of these things today, this is going to be new to me too.
I see.
So yeah, I mean, I know about the errors or contradictions, but how you resolve that, I think is important. So, anyway, hey, if you haven't seen the podcast number 1 for Pauline authorship of Hebrews, certainly recommend going to watch that first. But today we're looking at some contextual perceived errors. How would you describe that, Gary?
Yeah. Perceived errors, at least things that have come up over time. What I like to call the critics of Hebrews, that have brought this to our attention. And most of it is a misunderstanding, it turns out, that of actually the message of the book itself, that the lack of understanding of the proper backdrop to a lot of the arguments that are made in Hebrews causes people to infer things or to put a value on certain way things are said that leads to a misinterpretation of what's actually being said by the author. And so I think it is instructive. It's also important, of course, for the book of Hebrews that we look at these kinds of things, because it's pretty clear if there were serious errors in the book that would not only disqualify it as probably being from the hand of Paul, but it would also, cause one to question whether it should be in the canon at all,
Sure.
So it's an important one from that standpoint, but it's also important, I think, because this is one of these cases where I think the misunderstandings actually are an opportunity to get a deeper understanding of things that are actually central to the message of Hebrews. That's kind of why I wanted to touch upon it in part, was to hopefully impart some of that to your audience.
Yeah, so I was wondering, we're going to look at these 3 examples of contradictions in Hebrews. How does this play into, in your mind, to Paul being the author of Hebrews?
Yeah, in terms of Paul, I both on his, if you want to call it, intellectual prowess and his background in Judaism, and then combined with the fact that the man was, spirit-filled par excellence, right?
Right.
In other words, he in his writings and in his epistles just comes up with things that I regard in the context of his time as being literally otherworldly. It's otherworldly wisdom, that comes forth out of him. And so when you look at those aspects of the man Paul, and you realize, well, would the man like this make such glaring errors?
Yeah.
And you say to yourself, not likely, So I think it does impinge upon the authorship question directly. And of course, it also impinges on the message of Hebrews, because Hebrews is a radical book. I mean, I think, and I know you've come to appreciate it on a deeper level too in these recent years. I rank it up there with Romans, with Revelation, with, as far as depth, as far as, almost like transcendence in depth. It's just, it's one of these books. I mean, all of the New Testament is profoundly, when you view, even within the context of Judaism, let alone the larger pagan world at the time, these concepts are they're in another universe, literally, compared to how people were thinking about things in that period of time. And so I believe it is, important for us to address it on several levels. And that's when in fact, I had relegated this to just a small part of the series, which is why we're going to have an additional part 3, as it turns out, because when I looked at it, I said, we can't skip over this. This is just too important. And so I wanted to delegate a whole part to it to give it adequate time to develop it fully.
Well, speaking of otherworldly, Yeah, I want you to get right into it just because I know you're going to get to that Holy of Holies part.
Yeah.
And I think about what Paul, assuming it's Paul, was thinking, or how he expressed those ideas with regard to the Holy of Holies.
Yes.
So I'm not going to say too much there. I've read it. It looks good.
Okay.
Go ahead, Gary. Floor is
right.
yours.
Well, thank you.
I'll ask questions when I need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you should have plenty of time for that today. So the Hebrews chapter 9 is our focus today. And as we mentioned earlier, we're going to look at sort of three different claims of, quote, errors in the writing of Hebrews, specifically in that chapter. And in fact, most of the critiques do center on chapter 9, interestingly, in the book of Hebrews. It gets more attention than most of the other chapters by far. And I think one of the reasons for that, and we talked about this in the Melchizedek study, didn't we? We spent an entire session just on the book of Hebrews. And where did we focus? Well, we focused a great deal on chapters 9 and 10 and 8, those chapters. And the reason is that is the core and the heart of the message of Hebrews. I mean, that's where you might say the theme of Hebrews sort of crescendos. And then after that's over, then we kind of drift into this. Paul has, or the author, whoever it was, has these final sort of thoughts to share in chapters 11, 12, and 13, all of which, by the way, are very important and quite relevant, but they're not theologically as strong, as what occurs in the chapters about 7 or 6, arguably, through 10. And so this is really, I think, why we encounter this. And there's sort of like certain technical details, you might say, of things that are addressed in chapters 9 that when some people look at it, they feel that something was misstated. And they've inferred something, I think, from the author that is not really going along with what the point of the author is making.
Yeah, I think what I saw in seminary and in theological circles is that if there's something uncomfortable, either write it off as a contradiction, or they gloss over it or something.
Yeah,
and you just want to,
right.
People like you and me want to say, no, it's said like that on purpose. Let's not change it.
That's right.
Let's instead figure out what's going on here.
Correct. That's exactly right. And you expressed something I was going to express shortly thereafter, but it's fine. I think it's good you expressed it because you've been in the environment, you've taught in the environment, you know it well. And it is true that people, when they get uncomfortable with a subject or they can't figure it out, they have a hard time with that. And so they have to find some means in their own minds to reconcile something, right, in the text. And one of the things that I think you and I have learned in this way, as we continue to walk in this way, is that that's exactly the wrong thing to do. It is the wrong thing to do, but people have been doing it for centuries. What you need to do, and what I do a lot, is I have something I don't understand. I trust the word, and I take it and I say, okay, I think I understand this part of it. I need to understand this part of it, but I'm not there yet. So you know what I do? I can put it on the shelf and say, this I understand, this I don't understand, and that's okay. Because in time, I trust God, and as I mature and grow, maybe one day I will get the full picture.
And I would say, hey, the same would be true of the parts of the Bible that are uncomfortable.
Yes, absolutely.
You read it and you're like, oh my gosh, how could God allow that or whatever? And I want to say, hey, time out. That God is gracious, compassionate.
Yes.
All of it in the end looks like Jesus.
Yes.
So, let's quit fretting. It might sound harsh to you, but let's let the word say what it says. And once you get to the bottom of what's going on, here's what you're going to find.
That's right.
Exactly. Love.
Yeah, that's right.
Wholeness, goodness.
And I can say and declare in my 50 years of studying the word, 40 years of teaching it, that this is what I've discovered. This method that I just described to you worked well for me, to be able to put it aside and say, okay, it's all right. We don't know all things. We never know all things, but we don't know all that we're going to know at some point in time if we keep on the path. So being able to compartmentalize in a good way, I believe, and say, okay, I have this understanding. I know I don't have the full picture. And by the way, when that's the case, I'm limited in my teaching on the subject. I won't teach it if I don't have the full picture.
Mm.
But then I put it aside and I allow God to work in my life and grow. And at some point, I'll take that thing off the shelf, and now I will understand it.
Yep.
And I have to say, this has worked tremendously for me in my almost 5 decades of doing this now. And so I just, would encourage all of your audience to consider that approach, to consider that way of thinking about things. And as you point out, don't fret about it. Don't worry about it, because in time, these things will come. Look, the great men of God that are discussed in the Bible, like, I consider Moses in that stature, and Abraham and David. And what do we see in these individuals? Each one of them had encounters with God where they could not comprehend what God was doing. They completely could not comprehend it. They challenged God. They got in God's face about it sometimes. I mean, Moses especially. I mean, Moses was one of the boldest men I've ever seen. He's telling God, you can't do that. You can't be that way. To his face. Can you imagine? I mean, this is like, what?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine it.
Yeah.
See, this is the struggle God is looking for. This is what he wants from us. Because if you're not coming up with things that trouble you, you're not thinking. You're not thinking. You're not reflecting. You're not meditating. You're not getting deep. You stay at the surface level. And God doesn't want us staying at the surface level. He wants us to go deeper, because he knows the deeper we go, we will eventually come to truly know him and trust him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Good. Well, let's go on then. And we'll talk about these supposed errors then in the book of Hebrews. And I have 3 examples. One I will draw from Hebrews chapter 9 at the very beginning, verses 2 and 4, where some claim that the author erroneously placed the altar of incense inside the Holy of Holies. Now, when you think about that one, that's kind of a glaring error, isn't it? Almost. I mean, even very neophyte students of the Bible know better than that, right? So immediately I look at
you would think.
Yeah, you would think, right?
Don't test them.
Yeah. And I would think that, when you see something like that, and consider this, I mean, it's not even just about authorship now, that question is also about the audience. Who is this written to? It's written to a Jewish audience originally. People who grew up with this stuff.
Right.
And people, by the way, in the first century, they were very biblically literate. I don't know to what extent the literacy went beyond that, but when it came to the Bible, they were literate people.
Yeah.
They knew this stuff backward and forward. And in fact, many of them would have been to the temple and would have known this by firsthand experience.
Right.
So I look at that. When I first read about this, my immediate reaction was, what? Are you kidding? How could this book have been even taken seriously if that were true? And yet, in some Bible translations, that's exactly how it's translated. And we're going to see another case of a mistranslation.
Okay.
It's not there. Okay. So we'll look at that.
All right.
Example 2, which is in verses 18 to 22. There is a contradiction noted in the sprinkling of the blood, but it's not in the manner of the sprinkling of the blood that's discussed in those sections. And we'll go into this later in more detail so people know exactly what we're referring to, but that's the general tenor of that example. And it has, and it turns out that the answer is easily resolvable if you understand what the author is really saying, what he's doing from a rhetorical standpoint in that passage. And so we'll look at that. And then the final example, which is in some ways one of the most interesting of the 3, we have in Hebrews 9:23 this interesting phrase that's applied specifically to the sacrifice of Yeshua. And it's referred to as the better sacrifices. Okay. And it's in the plural.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we know the sacrifice of Messiah was a singular event. And there are people that have cited, this as well, what's with this? It's a contradiction, right? Everybody knows it was a singular sacrifice. And so why is it in the plural, And this is, by the way, a great illustration of what you shared just a moment ago about how, sometimes the way, the author is expressing something, there is an intentional rhetorical thing that's done. And that rhetorical thing could be to change a tense of a verb, to drive home something. It could be making a noun from the singular to the plural in order to alert the reader of something that's coming. And we're going to see this. In fact, the explanation to this comes right in the verses that follow, it turns out.
So in your research, is there any indication where maybe some scholars might have looked at this and say, the redactors messed up? They should have put it singular, and they kind of
and you would, you have to sort of consider that possibility. But as you know, with the Greek language the way it is, in the English, often you just you change the you add an S to something, right? Make it a plural or something.
Right.
It's generally, in many instances in English, it's a simple procedure to mix up what we call the number reference in a noun or something like that. But in Greek, it's much more involved than that. It generally will involve an article. It can involve other grammatical elements, often, of course, a verb, obviously. And in the Greek, the transformation of the verb is much more extensive than it is in the English. English can, again, often involve a letter or two transformation to change the tense of a verb. But in Greek, oh my gosh, on where it goes, right?
Yeah.
It can be a whole suffix that has to be replaced and that type of thing. So you kind of think that certainly those things would lend against the idea of an error that was accidental. It would had to have been perpetrated on purpose for some reason. But I believe that fortunately, those considerations are somewhat inconsequential, just because I'm going to make the case that it was intentional, that it was the point of the author to do that, and that point has been missed. So,
okay, well, I'm excited to get to example 3 because I know it's coming. I want to hear you explain it, though.
Yes. Thank you. Well, example 1, then, Hebrews 9, verses 2-4. I'll read these verses because it's important that they have them read and make reference to them as we discuss them. This section describes the tabernacle, the things that are in the tabernacle, and this is where the problem comes. Although I realize in citing, I use the New King James, and the New King James actually gets it correct. So what the hearer is going to hear is the actual translation the way it should be.
Yeah.
And by the way, the most modern translations now do get it right, but there are still some holdouts. And NASB, New American Standard Version, gets it wrong. But I noticed in their most recent version, they at least now footnote it and give the correct thing in the footnote.
Well, in scholarship, everyone's gotten kicked in the teeth, basically saying, hey, why, for example, in King James Version, Acts 12:4, I believe it is, says Easter and not Passover.
Yes. That was another obvious one, wasn't it? Yeah.
Right. Totally obvious. And scholarship is like, finally they came to their senses.
Yes, that's correct.
Why are we doing this?
That's
so, hey, a plug here for the Legacy Standard Bible. I'll give John MacArthur credit. They're putting Yahweh back in the Bible instead of Lord. And getting people refamiliar with the language. That's one of the biggest issues I have. We say Torah and people go,
what's that? Yeah.
What the heck? Oh, you legalistic person. You're not in love with Jesus anymore.
Yeah.
It's because you're not familiar with the language. It's a cultural issue.
It's a cultural issue.
So,
it is.
Anyway, scholarship, awesome. Coming to their senses. That's good.
Good. All right. And I'm glad to see it, by the way. And I appreciate it. I'm appreciating very much that I think the translators are becoming maybe just a little bit more aware about these things now, and they're taking a look back at some of the things that were done in the past, and that's a good thing. And I'm all in favor of it.
Me too. It makes our job a lot easier.
So verse 2 will start. It says, and it reads this: "For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part, in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread. We know that, of course, is the menorah and the table of the loaves, which is called the sanctuary, or we could substitute, in the Hebrew, it would be called the holy place, how it was referred to. It's that part of the tabernacle that was reserved for priestly ministration on a daily basis, basically. And then verse 3, and behind the second veil is the veil that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies. Behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all. And here's the verse now, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which there was a golden pot, or were a golden pot, that had the manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Okay. And this, of course, we know from the Old Testament. All that's just fine and dandy. The key here is in the word, the golden censer. In some of the translations, they translated the incense altar, the golden incense altar, because there was an altar of incense in the holy place upon which the high priest daily offered incense on that altar. Okay, so it was natural probably for some translators to say, well, the censer, that's referring to the golden incense altar, but in fact it is not. And the fact that it is not is critical to the entire chapter of Hebrews 9. It really is. Because it relates directly, as we're going to see, to the Day of Atonements.
Okay.
And what the author is interested in communicating, he's setting the stage here. This section was not just a matter of listing the items in the temple, or in the tabernacle, like people didn't know they were there, No, in fact, the author is being very careful to specify something that's unique to the Day of Atonements.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing for our listeners to know is when you turn the corner there at Hebrews 7, the author is situating their theology in the context of the Day of Atonements, plural.
Yes.
So it's like you really do need to understand the Day of Atonements and what's going on there and the role of the high priest in order to understand theologically what's happening in these chapters.
That's exactly right. It's indispensable. And for so long, much scholarship, it's changing now, and I'm glad it's changing. But for centuries and centuries, Christian scholars, these issues have been pretty much very mysterious to them, not well understood.
Oh yeah, you want to hear a funky sermon? Hear some pastor talk about Hebrews without understanding the Day of Atonement.
Yes, that's
not
exactly
good.
right.
Not a good thing.
Not good. No. And so this word, the censer, comes from the Greek and Strong's 2369. It's thaumaterion, and that word at its root means to fumigate or burn incense. The root word of that. And so one could, of course, apply that, and it can be applied to the incense altar, but actually its primary meaning is not that. It's actually censer. It's something that supports or holds the incense that is burned at the altar. And so we see, in fact, there's another word that's almost very closely related to it, thusisterion, in did I say thusisterion, which is the Greek 2379, which is very close. So it means the words are very likely closely related in the Greek. Which is translated altar in Luke 1:11, for instance. And there we have the story of Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, who was appointed, apparently the lot fell on him that year, to have the privilege of going in to the holy place, because he was of the priestly class, and he could offer the incense on the golden incense altar. So this particular episode is specifically key to the incense altar. There's no question that that's where he was and what he was doing when he did that. And that's, of course, where he receives the prophecy about having a son, John the Baptist. So that is firm. And we have it used again for in Matthew 5:23-24 for reference to probably the sacrificial altar in the inner court. It has that sense of referring to an altar specifically. Okay. But that is specifically not the word in Hebrews. It's the first word, which simply means censer, or that vessel, if you will, that holds the incense that is going to be used and be burned. Okay. So this is important because this makes all the difference in the understanding and the interpretation of this verse. And as we shared, the key to it is going to be seeing this in the context of the Day of Atonements. And we're quite right to do this because chapters 9 and 10 is all about the Day of Atonements. And we talked in the Melchizedek series that we did in Hebrews that I found at least 12. And now, since I did that, by the way, I found a few more. So I'll just say at least a dozen references specifically and undeniably to the Day of Atonement in those two chapters. Now, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's telling you something, right? That's telling you that, no, this is the backdrop to the entire discussion. And as you articulated well a moment ago, this is indispensable if you're going to understand what the author is really telling us in Hebrews. So let me give you a little more background then. And here we'll go through, I have some slides that have some pictures and drawn them from the reference of the Temple Institute. They have several publications, and these are scattered through several publications. You can find them through in their institute that deal with the temple, deal with priestly service and this type of thing. And for your viewers that are not familiar with the Temple Institute, it is the primary organization in the state of Israel right now that has taken upon itself the commission of readying everything that's required for the coming temple in Israel. And so what they've done, and I've known about them for 30 years. In fact, I knew the director, one of the directors of the Temple Institute as a friend. He was a personal friend.
Wow.
I have some interesting stories. And, his whole life has been dedicated, as well as the entire institute. They have a group of Jewish scholars that have studied not only the Torah and the Bible, but sources like the Mishnah and other sources fairly close to the time period that address areas in the temple, and an understanding of the basic traditions and technology that was involved, in the temple service. They've been able to fabricate all the implements required for the temple service. They all have them ready. It's all ready to go, and they're even training a priesthood, and they're looking for, the red heifer, and they're doing all this stuff, right? Yeah. In fact, really at the right time, they could get the temple service up and running on the Temple Mount, particularly if they did it with a tabernacle, something that they could just put up, right, in a very short time. They could do it in a matter of days.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. A matter of days. Under the right circumstances.
Yeah.
So I just want your audience to know these people are very serious. They are probably the most knowledgeable people on the planet when it comes to what were these implements like? What did they look like? How did they function? What did the priests do? What did the clothing look like? How did it function? What was it made out of? It's all of this stuff is what they've dedicated themselves to. So I draw from that source because I believe they're the best source that we have currently available.
I have as well, and it's pretty neat stuff.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It's really remarkable. It's a wonderful bit of historical analysis that they've done. I'm not saying that it's like 100% correct. I don't know. I think it's close to that figure, but I'm not an expert enough in those kind of details to be able to evaluate it. But I do trust that basically what they say should be taken seriously. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
About these things. So the altar of incense is here in this slide is being contrasted with what I call the censer and the shovel. So here's what you had. Every day of the year, maybe even including Yom Kippurim, though it was not an emphasis on that day if it was happening. I've never been clear about that point, to be frank with you. Did they do this on Yom Kippurim? But what I do know is the other service they did on Yom Kippurim, which is highlighted in Leviticus 16. And it's different than the daily service. So every day of the year, at least the other days of the year for sure, the high priest would go in the tabernacle time and in the first temple time, we believe. They would go in and they would bring coals from the altar outside, the sacrificial altar, and they would bring incense with them, and they would carry it into the holy place, and then they would put the coals on the fire pan of the altar of incense, and then they would bring a handful of incense and spread it over the coals while they're hot so that it would fumigate and give the incense rising up from the altar. Okay. And that was their daily service. I think they might have, I think they did it both morning and evening, but for sure they did it daily. So that was the normal protocol for offering this. But there was one exception. And that exception was on the Day of Atonements, when that is not what happened. Right. So I find it very interesting, just this point alone, if you look back at verse 4, or verse, is it verse 4? 3 or 4, right in there, wherever the altar gets mentioned. I think it's 4. If you look back at 4, if we're correct, the word is censer. That means the incense altar is not even mentioned. And that would be, from our standpoint, right, of course, because it's not a part of the formal service of the high priest on the Day of Atonements. But the censer is a formal part of the service. So why do I say that? Let's go on. Let's see what happens here. In the next slide, I show you a picture of the shovel and the censer. And you can see the shovel is a brass shovel, very beautifully done. And this, by the way, is a photo of, essentially it's an artistic rendering of a kind of photo. The other one is a photo of these implements. They've all been done. I've seen them. In fact, the censer, I was just thinking this morning, I said, I think I actually held the censer. I mean, I held it in my hands. And
oh my gosh.
I know. This is a funny story. I mean, I went there very early when the Temple Institute got started, and this is how I got to know some of the people. And I was just there taking pictures through a glass of the implements as they were in this cabinet, right? Because things they had made. And the director comes by and he wants to know who I am, and we get up a conversation. He says, "Gary, no problem. Here, I'll bring it out and I'll put them on the table, and you can turn them as you need them to get good pictures of." He gave me
Gentile. Come on.
He gave me full open privilege.
Oh, how
and
fun.
Trusted me to just do what I needed to do to get the pictures I wanted to get and take back to my friends and colleagues back in the States.
Now now give me a little bit of vibe here. People don't know your story. Okay, so you're in Israel. You went to the Temple Institute. These are the utensils, things that they are going to have ready. Does it seem to you that they're not holy in their mind, not holy until the tabernacle, the Shekinah glory comes?
That's a very interesting question, and I think you may be onto something. That they obviously feel there's a sacredness to them, but until they're actually consecrated,
right?
Yeah. Then I'm sure
he pulled it out for you.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not like it's under Fort Knox lock and key here.
No, it wasn't then. But now, by the way, you can't do that.
Okay. Well, you got lucky.
Yeah, I did. I was there at the very early time, and I was there at a time of year. I was at January. No, there was no tourists. I was the only one in the place, basically. And so I think he felt a genuineness on my part of what I was trying to do. And I didn't seek that. I was taking my pictures through the glass, and you know how that is, right? Reflections and everything like that.
Yeah, I did.
He saw that. He said, "Oh, wait a minute. Let me take them out for you. Here, let's maneuver them so that the lighting is good." And that's what I had the opportunity to do. And I knew from that point on, I said, "Wow, this is I would never have anticipated that in 1,000 years."
You're probably going to get to this. I don't know, but I think anyone who's been around the Bible a little bit. So this is a Day of Atonements thing where they're going to the priest.
Yes.
A high priest is going to take the
so let me describe that for you. I just wanted to, for the benefit of your viewer, just to point out, look at how beautiful these objects are.
Oh, yeah.
And they know a lot about them, and they know a lot about some of the artistic renderings of them, but there's probably been just, I'd say, a minor bit of license, a little bit. We could call it artistic license,
Sure.
but it stays true to the parameters that are known.
Right.
Okay. And the censor in particular is just a gorgeous article. It just is. And it has almost what I call a white gold appearance, doesn't it? When you look at it, the way that they finish this, it's fascinating. So the censer is the object that's in the lower right-hand corner of your slide. It's holding the incense. That's where the incense is located. And the priest will carry that in one hand, his left hand, it turns out, at least according to the diagrams that I've seen.
Okay.
And then the shovel is carried in the right hand. So, and what they do is they go, and the third slide here is the priest obtaining the coals from the sacrificial altar. So he has a shovel. He's just taking the shovel into the burnt remnants, of the sacrifices, the wood and the animals and everything, right?
Okay, so that's the question, Gary. I've always I don't know if is it explicit in Scripture, where are they getting these coals?
Coals, yeah.
Are they getting it from the altar in the courtyard, or are they getting it from the incense altar in the holy place and then taking it into the Holy of Holies?
Their view, and I have to tell you, in looking at the Torah, it is really that's one of the harder issues to be definitive on. It's sort of one of these areas where you go, I can see it from their point of view. I can see it from their point of view. And then you wonder, well, could it have been done another way? But apparently in the scholarship that they've developed on this subject, which is extensive and gets into a lot of sources that, to be honest with you, I'm not as well equipped to deal with, when you get into the Jewish Talmud and some of these things. The Mishnah, I feel a little more comfortable in, but some of these other things.
Yeah.
So probably I would say this is their best reconstruction.
And it would be consistent with what I think is going on.
Yes.
But
you can make a case for this. In other words,
that's what I would say. There's
a deep spiritual case for this. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's and I think the evidence seems to line up with that. But if you pressed it into the text of the Torah, you would just find there's maybe just a little bit of ambiguity about that. But it does work. In other words, if you take this model, you can apply it to the text and it works. So that's not the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is it the only possibility?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's more the issue there.
Yep.
Okay. So what I'll do is, like I said, I default to them for this part because I don't feel I'm qualified to challenge them.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah. So if that's the case, we'll just proceed with that in mind. And then the next slide shows two pictures, one with the high priest carrying, and you can see what he has to do here. He's supporting the coals that are taken from the outside altar. They're on the fire pan. They're, of course, smoking because burning coals will smoke. And then he's holding the it looks like bracing it with the palm of his left hand, the censer that's holding the incense. So he's taking both of those items. He has to balance them. And he has to walk the stairs and then go into the temple and bring it, as we're going to see, not to the incense altar, which apparently was what was done, according to their view, on the daily basis.
Okay.
So the daily administration of this incense offering was done at the altar of incense, you see. But this time, they go directly into the Holy of Holies, and only on this one day of the year. So the priest in the second slide that we see, he is carrying these implements and he is going between the curtains. Now, the veil is believed to be a sort of like, think of it as a draw curtain that opens in the middle. But in this case, it doesn't open in the middle. What it does is it overlaps so that the entry is on one end. We'll call it the right end. I think that's correct. It is the right end, but we'll call it that just for reference purposes. It's on the right side. Okay. You walk down in between the curtains and you enter the Holy of Holies on the left end.
I did not know that.
Yes.
I didn't know there was a double curtain.
Double curtain. Yeah. So this is the view, okay, how they've imagined it and they've represented it here. And if you think about it, there is a sense to it because it means that no one ever gets to see the priest going into the Holy of Holies. It's not possible to see the priest enter the Holy of Holies.
Right.
because you've got it covered on both sides.
Well, hey, listener, hold that one lightly. I don't know if I see that in scripture, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's possible.
Yes.
I see some latitude with Solomon in the way that he constructed things, right? You know?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
There was latitude given. And so one wonders, well, was this the original view or was it a later view? You know, that might be a more open question. You know, was it done like in the tabernacle this way, or was it more simple? But in the temple, it could very well have been done something like this. So we'll just go with that for now. But that's right. That's the best we can do in laying out these things. And then finally, the high priest brings it into the Holy of Holies, where the censer is put down on the ground.
Yeah.
The shovel is laid on the ground with the coals. So the shovel is not only bringing the coals in, it's kind of serving as the fire pan for the incense offering. And then the priest will take a hold of the censer, will pour incense into his hands, and then he will spread it over the coals right there in the Holy of Holies. Wow. And in the first temple and in the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant was there, and there were poles. And from everything that they can glean from the Torah, the priest went between the poles. He goes between the poles, because the poles actually, you can kind of see how the broad side of the altar, right? The poles hook on those narrow ends, on the smaller area ends of the ark, and it's transported that way. And so it would have been natural for the priest then to go between the poles and make that offering.
Well, in their image, they need a little bit more room between the end of the.
I agree. Yeah,
because he's. You know, that'd be a little awkward to kind of put.
No, you're absolutely. You know, it's funny you mentioned that. I thought the same thing. It's one of the best pictures they have, unfortunately. But you're right. I think a little more room on that side would have been good. I agree, because I don't know if the priest would have been comfortable bumping up against the curtain. You know, when he's going in there. Yeah, but it gives a good illustration. You know, you get at least a sense of how this was carried out, and so we can see from all of this that this ceremony then was distinctive. There was something that God had in mind, and we won't go into today all the details of that because it's rather involved. But I will just say that the one thing that impresses me about this picture, and maybe, you know, if some of the translators had imagined something like this, maybe that's why they got confused about the altar of incense. I don't know what was stimulating all that in the past, but what I see in this ceremony is that this was the day of the year when, in effect, if in a functional sense, certainly, I mean, in a functional sense, the altar of incense, it was like it was being transported into the Holy of Holies. One day of the year. Yeah. And you couldn't take the altar itself because it was overlaid with gold. You know how heavy gold is? There's no way one person could have carried that. It would have taken at least two people to carry that altar into the so you couldn't have done it physically, but functionally you can do it, because that's what they did. They went through the entire ceremony just as they would have done it each day, except where the destination was. Instead of stopping at the altar of incense, they continued on into the Holy of Holies and made the offering directly there. Isn't that interesting?
Well, like you said, we can't get into it, but that has theological implications that are
that's correct.
Pretty neat.
Yes. Yeah. And we touched on a little of that in the Melchizedek study, but we can definitely mine it out a lot more. Yeah. Unfortunately, not today. But this is the answer. So problem solved, right?
Okay.
Once you understand this aspect of the problem, then the resolution is actually almost intuitively obvious. What the author was doing there, and particularly when you know that these verses are the introduction to this entire section of Hebrews. So we'll move on.
Yeah, we got about 10 minutes each for each.
Okay, that sounds about right.
Okay.
Example 2, Hebrews 9:18-22, and I'll read it, has to do with this business of the sprinkling. Therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. Verse 19, for when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you. Then likewise he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. This would be of the Levitical ministry. Verse 22 is important to keep in mind in our discussion, so I'll emphasize it. Verse 22, and according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. Now, this is kind of the punchline. So, in other words, if we want to know what this section is really pointing us toward, it's pointing us toward verse 22, and that is important. So, what do we have here? Well, the misunderstanding that comes is the critics argue, in effect, that the author here is linking two separate events without distinguishing them in time or place. And they're right about that, by the way, and so there's something to them that resonates as this is not correct. What was stated, in verse 21, I think is the problem verse. I don't have it here with me, or do I? Well, we'll get back to it. So the not distinguishing in time or place. In other words, there's a sprinkling of the blood on the book and all the people that's occurring. And then there's a sprinkling of the blood on the altar and the other implements of the Levitical ministry that's occurring. And the author gives the impression that this all occurred at the same time. And that's what's tripping up some of the critics.
Okay.
The first event is given in verse 19 of Hebrews 9, and it's referring back to Exodus 24, 6-8, which describes the sprinkling on the book, the covenant itself, the words of the law, if you will, and the people sometime shortly after the Pentecost event at Sinai. Now you can see by where it is, Exodus 24 occurs shortly after, right? God comes down on the mountain to give the law to the people. And that law is the basis for the covenant. So right there at Sinai, God is making a covenant with the people of Israel. And then what's happening is there's kind of a ratification ceremony that takes place shortly after that, where the people say, all that God has asked us to do, commanded us to do, we will do it, and then the covenant is ratified. So there's that event. And then there is this mention of the service of the Levites, their implements and the tabernacle and this type of thing. And people don't realize, well, you know what? None of that stuff had even been built yet in the original, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that comes later. And in a sense, the timing is very interesting because, again, when you look at that particular service and sprinkling the blood on the implements of the services of the Levitical ministry, when does that occur? It occurs on Yom Kippurim. See, so there's a direct tying of this discussion, again, back to Yom Kippurim. It occurs at a different time, to be sure, but the author is telling us these events, though they were separated in time and in location, they are tied together as a kind of singular event, even though there's a time gap in the middle of them. And when you understand the nature of Yom Kippurim, then you begin to understand it, because the ratification was a ceremony that was just one time. They didn't repeat it. It didn't happen all the time every year. But Yom Kippurim was a ceremony that happened every year, annually, for the people.
Okay.
And so these things are, I think, critical to understanding this point. And to be honest, the gap in time then can be understood if you just understand that the author rhetorically is putting the two events together intentionally, treating them as a singular event, because there is a singularness to the composite story that these two events are telling. Think about it. You've got blood on the book. You've got blood on the people. Now, by the way, that probably wasn't all the people. There were 2 million out there, according to the Bible, in the desert. So Moses couldn't have sprinkled all of them. He probably sprinkled the heads of the tribes, each of the tribes, and the representatives of the people.
Mm-hmm.
That's most likely what occurred. So you have that occurring. That's a one-time event. But a related event is the Yom Kippurim service, where now even the Levites, even the high priest, the implements of the ministry, all of these things, the tabernacle, so it gets covered, right? Purified with blood. And the point of the author is in 22. he's given an illustration, a twofold illustration that he believes is linked together in its theological significance. Not in time, but in the theological significance. And so it's a rhetorical style that is used by the author to do that and to show that, yes, even the most central aspects of the covenant and of the ministry of God before the people in the Tanakh, all were purified with blood. And that's his point. That's the central point.
On this one, we have this 4-month gap between the events. So we have
minimum. Actually, it's probably more than that, but yeah. For the first one.
But what's the gap? Is the gap can't be between Passover and Yom Kippurim, because we have first month and 7th month. So
it's Pentecost, or that roughly that time, around Pentecost to Sukkot, or to Yom Kippurim. Yeah, that would be the gap.
Okay, yeah.
In terms of its annual significance, and that's one thing I probably should just specify, that if we look at the annual calendar, the calendar of the year, that's the gap, in time. Now, physically, the gap was probably a little longer because it took them a while to build the tabernacle. You know the story, and that takes place over the close to 8 or 10 chapters of the book of Exodus, and so. There's a little larger gap, but the idea is if we were to view these events and say we were to take note on a Pentecost, typical Pentecost, and immediately after Pentecost, the ceremony of the ratification took place, which we do acknowledge, and we mention that from time to time as in our discussions of these festival days. Then the next thing that happens, the second part of this occurs at Yom Kippurim, which is about a 4-month gap. You're right.
Okay, so the ratification or the consecration, this is happening on Shavuot or Pentecost. Yes?
Right after, probably.
Okay, so right after, then we have this 4-month gap. And if I might just interject here, in the same way, from Feast of First Fruits, you count 50 up to Shavuot.
Yes.
You have in Leviticus 25, you have the Shemitah years, which is every 7 sevens up to the Yovel or the Jubilee year, which Jubilee happens on Yom Kippurim.
That's correct. That's when it's announced.
There's this thing there's a tie theologically between Shavuot and Yom Kippurim.
By the way, in Judaism, this is known that there is a relationship, and I might have even made allusion to this a little bit. Remember when I talked about the menorah way back? Yeah. It's interesting. If you look at the branches of the menorah and have that done correctly, with Yom Teruah or the Feast of Trumpets in the middle, what's on either side? Pentecost, Yom Kippurim. So there's a chiasm there that demonstrates that Pentecost is in some way related to Yom Kippurim. There's a tie. There's a spiritual tie between those two.
Yeah, and I think I want people to get excited. There is a clear tie between what's happening with the spring feast and the fall feast.
That's right.
And here in Hebrews, it seems like it's bringing it together.
That's exactly what it does. That's correct. That's right. So it's a package deal, by the way. It's not a matter of, doing this or the other one. It's a package deal.
Yeah.
To get the full picture, you have to understand.
Well, and just to think, viewer, that our Messiah is going to return, and the Yom Kippurim is going to play out. I guess before our eyes. I don't know. Just do all you keep doing the rehearsals, the spring feasts, appointed times, the fall feasts, and that way, when you're standing there, I think a lot of people think, well, if I don't do that, I'm just going to get downloaded that information. I don't know that you're gonna.
No,
you're humans. Yahweh's given us instruction. Let's do those things. So we can appreciate what's happening right before us.
On that point, and I know for time's sake we'll have to go on, but it's an interesting discussion because I think people make this mistake. They think that just merely walking through something intellectually gives them understanding. According to God, that is not true.
That is not true.
That is not true. And so by not following it through, by not walking it through, you miss the critical elements that will allow you to make the connections God wants you to make in these things.
Yeah. Hey,
and I've seen very intelligent people, very smart scholars completely miss the point because all they've done is try to intellectually understand them. They have not walked it through. If you try to walk it through, you will immediately encounter things where you go, wait a minute, what am I doing? What is this? And you're forced to evaluate. You're forced to reflect upon it. And when you do, it becomes a part of you. And now you understand.
Yeah. Discipleship is not knowing your Bible.
No.
Your discipleship is knowing it by doing it. You've got to do it. You can't you just can't read your Bible every day and think, oh yeah, I'm a disciple now.
Yes.
Nope, you got to do it.
You got to do it. Amen.
Okay.
Example 3 then. So we probably, we could elaborate on this one, but I know our time is short, so I'll try to get right to the punchline. So in 9:23, I'll read that one first because this is where the problem is. And then I'll show you how the verses that follow basically unpack it. So therefore, it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these. Already we have things in these, right? We're in the plural.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But these things, of course, are referring to the these, and the second these is referring to the sacrifices themselves, and the things in the heavens are referring to the implements of the ministry of the priest who's in the heavenly temple, which is Messiah himself. See, Moses was told, I'm going to give you a copy of something that's in the heaven that you're going to put on the earth, right? So the tabernacle and the temples are earthly copies of something in heaven, according to the standard biblical view. So this is the reference that the author is making. He's drawing our attention to the fact that one is a representative of the other. And the earthly ones were purified with animal sacrifices and the blood of animals. That's these in this case.
Mm-hmm.
But he says, but the heavenly things, the heavenly implements of ministry and the priest and all these, everything that goes with it, right? It'd be everything that goes with it. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. These again is the animal sacrifices. So there was sacrifices that were made that are superior to the animal sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That allow even the heavenly implements of ministry. I mean, this is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Yeah, I know. It's mind-blowing, right? Even these things get purified. Now think about that. So the author is trying to show that as the pattern is on earth, so it is in heaven, and through the sacrifice of Messiah, this will be addressed. That's the whole point. But the problem that we have here is that the better sacrifices, it's clearly in the plural, and we know that the sacrifice of Messiah was a one-time event, right? Occurred once in space and time.
Yep.
Somewhere around between 30 to 33 AD.
Yep.
Yeah. And so what gives? And that's the problem.
Right.
So when you first look at this, it does give you pause. You step back and you think, well, that's kind of bizarre. Why was it put in the plural? And then, like we've encountered before, and this is why looking at some of these controversies can be so helpful, because when you get doing this, you begin to understand, you know what? These other times when I've looked into something like this, there's always something I missed that's the key to the resolution. And if I just think harder, as you mentioned earlier, about the problem, maybe I can get to the solution. So the Messiah was clearly sacrificed only once. And so for that reason, you naturally think, well, the singular form would have made much more sense here than the plural. Therefore, what that really means, not a contradiction, not a problem, really. It's what is the author trying to tell us?
Yeah.
Why did he put it in the plural? And I believe he intentionally put it in the plural. So that's what we'll talk about. So the solution I offer is to go to what follows. So we'll read this, and then we'll state a few things about this, and we'll be able to conclude. Verse 24. Notice 24, it's the next verse. He's using 23 now, because 23, by the way, is breaking into a new point. It's a new point. It's like a new paragraph. It's like the first sentence of a new paragraph. And now he's going to continue, and he's going to talk about that point in verse 23. So here it is. For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true. There we are. But into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God, God the Father, for us. 25. Not that he should offer himself often as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with the blood of another. And that blood of another is the blood of an animal, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That, of course, would have been well known to the audience. He then would have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time apart from sin for salvation. So here's how I understand that. These verses show that the Messiah made the ultimate sacrifice, one that only he could make. This, by the way, is in the greater argument of Hebrews. As you look at these chapters of Hebrews, Hebrews makes that point very clear. He is the only one that could have made this sacrifice. And we could muse, if we had the time, why that was the case. We won't have time for that today, but maybe at the beginning of next time we could spend a little time on that.
Okay.
That only he could make once for all time. Once for all time. Not a repeated event in space and time, but nevertheless repeated in application, continuing indefinitely as required. And I'll just add here, not only in the future, but also in the past. Throughout all time, it applied in both directions. And this is implicit in the argument that the author is making here. In this sense, one sacrifice becomes many, because the same one can be used whenever necessary without limit. What does he say in Hebrews in 9:24? He says the priest had to get blood of another each time he made the sacrifice, didn't he?
Yeah.
He had to slaughter another animal. Okay, that's not needed anymore. Because this sacrifice was transcendent. This sacrifice does not require being repeated. Once is infinitely more than enough.
You know, on this point, when people consider what Yeshua has done for us as Passover lamb, I want to say, hey, folks, make sure that you're reading Leviticus 1 through 7.
Yeah, 7. Yeah.
You got to know sin offering, trespass offering, burnt offering, meal offering, and shalom offering, peace offering. Because the sacrifice of our Messiah was multifaceted.
Yes.
Not only so in the regard that you're talking about many sacrifices fulfilled in this one person,
yes,
but also the dynamic of what is happening in his sacrifice, as explained in the opening chapters of Leviticus. You're just like, oh my gosh.
Yes.
And I think too, this would lend so well to, pastors, teachers. We're so fixated on the salvation message.
Yes.
Rightly so. Look, I mean, this is pivotal.
Yeah, it's kind of a bottom line, isn't it?
Yeah, we need to get
that.
there.
Yeah.
But there are things that in our purification process that happens through our Messiah too on the cross.
Yes.
As Passover lamb.
That's exactly right.
I'm like, oh
boy, yeah.
We got to know more of this stuff.
We do. And it's a real tragedy that in the body of Messiah as a whole, the average believer's understanding of that second point that you mentioned, on the issues that pertain to purification and sanctification are not well understood. They're not well understood. And it's a true tragedy. And they would understand it if they went back to Leviticus.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. You hear me beat this drum all the time. Yeah. You just cannot understand the New Testament without first understanding the backdrop of it.
Yes, that's correct.
Because there is an assumption made when Paul is writing that the Hebrew scriptures first.
Yes, that's right. And by the way, in Hebrews, he was right to make the assumption that his audience, if it was Paul that wrote it, we'll get more to that next week.
Yeah.
he would know his audience would understand these things. So what that does is when you know your audience has great familiarity with the subject matter, even if they hadn't pieced together all the components, before, and apparently they hadn't, the fact that they have the familiarity with it means that he can just mention things just out there, throw them out there, and he knows that his audience has the capacity to put those pieces together and come to the right understanding.
Well, hey, folks, I know this is a little mini series here on the authorship of Hebrews. And I know this is a question of canonization, a question of errors that are not errors. But it's all understanding a little bit more of the Apostle Paul, not just with regard to the book of Hebrews, but also to understand other theological texts, the other epistles, so that you could better get what's going on in Hebrews and Galatians.
Yes.
Because they all work together.
They all work together. That's right. So I'll just mention that this is summarized also, this statement in verse 12 of chapter 9, where the writer says, with his own blood, Messiah's, he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. That's a big statement, eternal redemption. One sacrifice was the equivalent of many, a countless many, indeed, an eternal many. And this, I believe, is more than ample reason for the author in verse 23 to speak of these as many sacrifices, as better sacrifices, to give it the plural, because what it functionally accomplished is that very thing. Functionally, it was one event that functionally accomplished everything for all time.
Amen.
Yeah, amen. So the book of Hebrews explains the book of Hebrews. If you just read on and the statement troubles you, look at what's behind it. And very often what you will see is the author telling you how to properly interpret that passage.
Okay, that it? We good for today?
That's good for today.
Hey, listener, look, I got an axe to grind, and one of those axes, I got many axes to grind. One of them is that somehow that Gary and I and others are somehow in love with the Torah. We are in love with Yeshua, Jesus, and to strip Jesus from the word that he embodied. I mean, this is how we get to know our Messiah.
That's correct.
So you just need to hear the order here. We are in love with Messiah. We get to know our Messiah, appreciate our Messiah, be intimate with our Messiah, because we are being disciples. We are doing the word, and we've got to read the word, understand the word. We're not just going through the motions. Gary and I are seeking to do the appointed times and understand the context of the appointed times, because we're not only doing it, but we're doing it understanding meaning. And that's why you're on the channel, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's why everyone needs to understand that the goal is our relationship with our Messiah.
That's right.
This is not about legalism. This is about love. It's about love. Yeah, so just hear that from me and Gary. Hey, we call it Everyday Torah. Why? We got to live this stuff every day. We got nothing else better to do. This is what we are about, to get to know the God that made us, our Messiah that loves us. And that's why we call it Everyday Torah. We'll see you next time.